Instead, Patrick became the errand boy of the house, expected to do all the hard work while the real children of the house went to school, played, and lived carefree lives. In a small town in western Nigeria, there lived a girl called Jennifer, but everyone knew her as Jenny. She was the third of four children, and if there was one thing she could say about her family, it was that they may not have much, but they were always rich in love. Her parents, though far from wealthy, worked hard and believed in living a life of contentment. They taught their children never to want what they couldn't afford, always saying, live within your means until you can do better. The story was one that always brought tears to Jenny's eyes whenever she thought about it. It was a story of survival, of loss, but also of love and resilience. Her father, Patrick, often shared how his life had changed the moment his parents died. He had been just a little boy when it happened, too young to fully understand what was going on, but old enough to feel the weight of it. After their parents passed, Patrick and his only sister were separated, sent to live with different relatives. We were shared like property, Patrick would say, his voice heavy with sadness. He had been sent to live with a distant uncle who barely treated him like family. Instead, Patrick became the errand boy of the house, expected to do all the hard work while the real children of the house went to school, played, and lived carefree lives. Patrick was often beaten for small mistakes, punishment for things that weren't his fault. Even years later, he still bore some of the scars from those beatings. But the worst part, he said, wasn't even the physical pain. It was the fact that he was never allowed to see the pages of a book, never given the chances to hold a pencil. School was out of the question for him, and that was the deepest wound of all. His parents had told him and his sister how important education was, but now he was locked out of that world, forced to watch from the outside as other children walked to school, laughing and carrying their books. Through it all, Patrick held onto one hope that his sister, who had been sent to live with one of their wealthier relatives, was doing better. He believed that she was being cared for, loved, and maybe even attending school like they had always dreamed. He clung to that hope even as his own life seemed to fall apart. But life, as Patrick learned, had a way of breaking even the strongest hopes. One day, after years of suffering and humiliation, Patrick couldn't take it anymore. He ran away, gathering up whatever small change he could beg for, and made his way back to the village. He was filled with determination, thinking he would find his sister and they could rebuild their lives together. But when he arrived, tired and broken, he was met with news that shattered him. His sister had died of pneumonia not long after she was sent away. No one had bothered to tell him. She was gone, and he had never even had the chance to say goodbye. Patrick would often tell the story, his voice breaking just a little. I remember standing there, he would say, staring at the spot where they buried her, and feeling like I had nothing left. I felt cheated and angry. My sister was all I had left in the world. And they not only left her to die so unnecessarily, but they didn't even count it important enough to tell me. He would pause here, his eyes filled with a sadness that was hard to watch. All he had was a cold, which they ignored, and it entered her lungs. Still, they ignored it. I shivered at how much she must have suffered, perhaps calling for me, and I didn't hear. I didn't know how to continue living after that. I carried hatred and anger and bitterness on my insides. For a long time, Patrick said those feelings consumed him. He didn't know how to move forward, how to live with the pain of losing the only person he had left in the world. He had no family, no home, no future. But then he would say, his voice softening, I met your mother. Her presence was God's consolation, and her coming into my life orchestrated my healing process. Jenny's mother had a different story, but in many ways, it was just as heartbreaking. She grew up in the city, where her mother died when she was still young. After that, her father remarried, but her stepmother didn't want anything to do with her. Jenny's mother was pushed aside, unwanted in the home where she had once been the center of her mother's world. Eventually, she was sent to live with her maternal grandmother in a small village. It was there, far from the city she had once called home, that Jenny's mother met Patrick. They became each other's solace, two lost souls who had been abandoned by life but found a flicker of hope in one another. Jenny's mother, with her gentle spirit, helped Patrick heal from the scars of the past. And Patrick, with his resilience and determination, gave her mother the strength to believe in a future again. After Jenny's maternal grandmother passed away, her parents decided to get married and move back to the city. They had no idea what the future held, but they were ready to face it together. They worked hard, taking whatever jobs they could find, never complaining even when things seemed impossible. They were determined to build a life, to create the family they had both been deprived of. That was how Jenny and her three siblings came into the picture. They were everything to their parents. Jenny's parents always told them that they weren't just their children, they were their siblings, their parents, and their entire world. Patrick and his wife had chosen to have four children, even though they could have stopped at two, because they wanted a full family. They wanted what they had lost, a house filled with laughter, love, and the warmth of a family that sticks together no matter what. Patrick worked odd jobs. He was a driver when there was work, a bus conductor when there wasn't, and a laborer at construction sites when nothing else was available. Jenny's mother sold whatever was in season. One day it was corn, the next day it was plantains, fruits, or vegetable. She was always on her feet, always moving, always trying to make sure there was food on the table and clothes on their backs. Life wasn't easy, but it was pleasant. They were a family, and that was what mattered. Jenny's parents were honest about their struggles. They didn't hide their hardships from their children. And because of that, Jenny and her siblings learned early on how to appreciate everything their parents did for them. Jenny's parents had a rule. They never allowed their children to help them with their work during the school time. Your job is to study, Patrick would say, his eyes filled with the same determination that had carried him through life. I wasn't given the chance, but you will be. After school, Jenny and her siblings would come home, cook, eat, do their homework, and get ready for the next day. Even on weekends, their parents didn't ask them to help with selling. Their education was too important to be compromised. Patrick and his wife wanted their children to have the chances they had never been given. That was how their family operated. They were close knit, always looking out for one another. Jenny and her siblings knew better than to ask for things their parents couldn't afford. It wasn't out of fear, it was out of respect. They understood how hard their parents worked, and they were careful with everything they had because they knew how much it had cost their parents, not just in money, but in effort and sacrifice. Jenny's school bag, for example, was handed down from her immediate elder sister, who had received it from their elder brother before her. It wasn't fancy or new, but it did the job. They shared what they had, and that was just how things were. Though they didn't have the latest clothes, and while some kids at school came in shiny new uniforms or carried flashy shoes, Jenny and her siblings never felt bad about their situation. Their parents made sure they had what really mattered. They were never sent out of school because of unpaid fees. Their books were always paid for. And though their meals might not have been the fanciest, there was always something warm in their bellies. There was a sense of pride in how they lived. Patrick and his wife had taught their children that while they might not have the best of everything, they were better off because they had love and family. And that was more important than anything money could buy. We had a lot of lessons in life growing up the way we did. Jenny would later reflect. Her parents taught them not just to be content with what they had, but also to never envy those who had more. You never know the price people pay for what they have. Her mother would say, be grateful for what you have because someone else is looking at you, wishing they had what you take for granted. And that's how they lived, grateful, careful, and full of love. After finishing secondary school, Jenny found herself at a crossroads. Like any other teenager, she had dreams, but she also understood the weight of her family's struggles. She knew that nothing came easy and every decision carried a responsibility. So instead of rushing into university, Jenny decided to take a year off and work as a teacher at a small local school. It wasn't a grand job, but it was enough to save a little and support her parents. You see, Jenny's parents had always wanted all their children to become university graduates. It was their dreams, a dream built on the pain of Patrick's missed opportunities and the hardships they had both endured. But as the children grew older, life had other plans. Jenny's older sister Adana, who had finished secondary school before her, decided that she didn't want to follow that path. She wanted to be a tailor. This wasn't what her parents had envisioned, especially Patrick. He wasn't happy at first, and Jenny remembered the arguments, long, frustrating debates about why education was important and why her sister was throwing away the chance they had worked so hard to give her. But Adana stood her ground. She was determined, and even though Patrick wasn't pleased, life had a way of forcing acceptance. Around the same time, Jenny's younger brother fell seriously ill, and the money that had been saved for her sister's university education had to be used for his hospital bills. It was a difficult time for all of them. Jenny was also getting ready to write her senior exams, and the family savings were stretched thin. In the end, Adana was allowed to pursue tailoring. Patrick, though reluctant, saw that it was the best choice given their circumstances. Her sister wasn't giving up on her dreams. She was just following a different path. And in their family, they had learned that sometimes you just had to adjust to what life threw at you. Meanwhile, Jenny's elder brother Ifani, who had always been obsessed with technology, found his own way forward. Without the funds to attend university, he started learning programming from a friend. He was too good at anything that has to do with tech, and even though the family couldn't afford formal education for him, he was determined to learn everything he could manually. One day, he promised Patrick, I'm going to get my degree in computer engineering. Jenny believed him. They all did. Her brother was the kind of person who never gave up once he set his mind to something. As for Jenny, she asked her parents for a year, just 1 year to work, earn a little, and give some space for her younger brother to finish his own senior exams. After that, they could figure out the next steps. Jenny knew her parents wanted her to go straight to university, but they understood it wasn't an easy decision for them, but they knew the value of patience. Every morning, she walked to the little school where she taught, and though the salary was small, it felt good to contribute. Her sister, now well in her tailoring apprenticeship, had started gathering money to buy her own sewing machine. Jenny wanted to help her, so she loaned her sister some of the little she earned. It wasn't much, but they were used to making do with what they had. Her sister promised to pay her back once she had set up her own business. Jenny didn't mind. It was part of their school savings, but she knew it would come back in time. Those were busy days for all of them. Her sister was learning, Jenny was teaching, their brother was programming, and their parents were still hustling, just like they always had. But through it all, they held on to one thing: hope. Hope that things would get better. Hope that they will all find their way. But life in their family wasn't just about survival, it was also about facing the judgment of others. People always seemed to have something to say, and most of it wasn't kind. Patrick, who had worked his whole life doing whatever jobs he could find, was often looked down upon. People didn't see the man who toiled day and night to provide for his family. They saw only his calloused hands, his worn clothes, and the dirt that clung to his skin after a long day of work. They didn't understand the pride he took in his work or the sacrifices he made for his children. Jenny remembered one day when she had gone to take lunch to her father at a construction site where he was working as a laborer. After he had eaten and rested a while, he got up to continue his work, telling her to go home so the cement dust wouldn't affect her. But Jenny, wanting to stay with her father, stayed out of his sight but remained within the vicinity of the construction site. Watching how hard her father works for them, Patrick was hauling bags of cement, his muscles straining under the weight. As she stood there with the sun blazing hot and the dust from the site hanging onto everything, she heard the familiar snickering of people nearby. Imagine, one man said loudly, as if Patrick couldn't hear, working like a servant and still not able to send his kids to school. What's the point? The other man grinned and shook his head. Some people just don't know when to give up. All that hard work for what? It's not like his children are going to amount to anything. The words were meant to sting, and they did. Jenny saw her father stiffen, but he said nothing, continuing his work in silence. He lifted the heavy bags, his hands steady, his face expressionless, but Jenny knew him too well. Those words had hurt, not because they were true, but because they attacked the one thing he valued most: his ability to provide for his family. Later that day, as they walked home, after her father had rebuked her for not going home as she was told, Jenny couldn't hold back her frustration. "Why do people have to be so cruel, Dad?" she asked, her voice bubbling with anger. "They don't even know us." Patrick gave her that tired, knowing smile. "Jennifer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "people will always talk, especially when they don't understand what it means to work hard. They see a man like me working with my hands and they think it's something to look down on. But there is nothing shameful about honest work." "But it's not fair," Jenny said, her voice shaking with anger. "You are doing everything you can." Her father stopped working and looked at her, his eyes serious. "Life isn't about fair, Jenny," he said softly. "Life rarely treats us fair. You must demand what you deserve from it. Don't sit around waiting for it to treat you fairly, because it may not. You must learn to do what is right for yourself, for your family, and for the people around you. Let them laugh, let them mock. At the end of the day, I know I'm working hard to give you a better future. That's all that matters." One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with her mother, she finally let out the frustration she had been holding inside. "Mom, I met some of my former classmates some days ago and they were mocking and calling me a dropout," Jenny said, her voice heavy with emotions. "They think I'm wasting my potential because I'm not going to university right away. It's like everything I did in school doesn't matter anymore." Her mother looked at her with kind, understanding eyes, her heart breaking for her daughter. She dropped what she was doing and reached across the table to take Jenny's hand. "People will always have something to say, Jenny," she said softly. "They don't know what you are doing for this family, and they don't need to. You made a choice out of love and responsibility. That takes courage. Not everyone has that." Jenny nodded, trying to let her mother's words sink in, but the sting of her classmates still lingered. Her mother continued, her voice gentle but firm. You are on your own path. Just because it looks different from theirs doesn't mean it's any less valuable. Remember, the most important thing is to stay true to yourself and your values. Your education isn't over, it's just on a different timeline. When the time is right, you will get there. Jenny knew her mother was right. She had to remind herself that the journey she was on was her own. It didn't matter if it didn't fit in the mold of what others expected. What mattered was that she was doing what she needed to do for her family, and when the time came, she would continue her education on her terms. The family had been navigating their challenges, ridicules, and judgments from the world, but nothing could have prepared them for the blow that was about to hit. Jenny had been working for a few months when she came home one evening to find a crowd in front of their compound. Her heart pounded in her chest. What was going on? As she pushed her way through the gathering, she noticed people turning to look at her with sympathy in their eyes. Someone came up to her and said, I'm so sorry, Jenny. Sorry for what? She asked, her voice trembling as fear crept into her heart. Her sister Adana, who must have heard people calling her name, came rushing out from the house, screaming, but Jenny couldn't make sense of her words. Suddenly, it was as if a loud bang exploded in her ears and she couldn't hear anything. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion as her vision blurred. She left her sister outside and walked through the crowd, pushing everything out of her way. When she entered the house, she saw her mother sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face. She was surrounded by neighbors, all looking sad. Jenny rushed to her mother's side and knelt down beside her. Mom, she whispered, her voice shaky. Why are you crying? Her mother grabbed her hand, her grip weak but desperate. Your father, he has done his worst. Your father has left me, oh, he is gone, her mother said, her voice choked with sobs. He left me on a journey of no return. At first, nothing they said made sense, but when her brain was able to decode their words, her world shattered. Her father, the man who had given everything for his family, was gone. The news was like a knife to her heart, twisting deeper with every passing second. Her father had been working as a bus conductor that day. Despite their pleas for him to stop, he had insisted that the job brought in quick money, and with no other options available, he continued to do what he needed to do. According to the stories, a tanker had fallen that day, and the bus their father was on had been caught in the middle. And being that he was close to the open door, managed to jump out in time, but he saw a child trapped under the bus. Without thinking of his own safety, he crawled back under to rescue the child. Before he could get out, there was an explosion. Patrick didn't survive. His death shattered their family. The man who had been their pillar, who had sacrificed everything to provide for them, was gone. The grief was unbearable. After that day, everything felt unreal, like they were living in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. There was an overwhelming sense of disbelief. None of them could fully accept that their father was gone. The world felt strange and foreign without him in it, and they kept expecting him to walk through the door with his familiar smile and tired but comforting presence. Jenny found herself trapped in a circle of denial. For days, she would wake up longing it had all been some terrible mistake. There had been accidents before where people had been misidentified, right? Maybe this was one of those. Maybe dad was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found, she would think. But reality has a cruel way of seeping in, little by little, until there is no denying it anymore. Every time she walked past his empty chair or saw his work tools gathering dust, it hit her again, and every time it felt like a fresh wound. Confusion and anger filled every corner of their home. Their mother, who had always been the pillar of strength in the family, now seemed lost, like a ship without an anchor. She wandered around the house, her eyes red from crying, as if searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I don't understand, she kept saying over and over. How can someone so good, so kind be taken like this? Why did God allow it? What have we done to deserve this? They could see the pain in her eyes. The way her faith, once so strong, had been shaken to its core. She had always believed that no matter what life threw at us, God had a plan. But now, that belief was crumbling under the weight of her grief. Jenny especially wanted to comfort her, to say something that would make it all make sense. But how could she? She didn't understand it either. The word felt unfair, cruel, and indifferent. Jenny kept replaying the story in her mind. The tanker, the explosion, the child that their father had saved. Everyone talked about how heroic it was, how he had sacrificed his life to save someone else. But all she could think was, why? Why did it have to cost him his life? She couldn't shake the feeling that the world was playing some kind of twisted game with them. It wasn't enough that they had struggled for far too long, but now had to suffer even more, losing the one person who had held them all together. Nights were the worst, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Jenny couldn't stop her mind from spiraling into dark places. She started questioning everything, their lives, their purpose, whether all the hard work and sacrifices they had made were worth anything at all. What was the point of trying so hard if in the end life could just take it all away in an instant? Sometimes she wondered if they were being punished. For what though? She didn't know, but it sure felt like the universe had singled them out, handing them one misfortune after another. First, they had to fight against poverty. Then they had to watch as their father, despite his best effort, was belittled and mocked for the work he did. And now, after all the hardship, he was taken from them in the cruelest way possible. She kept asking herself, why does it have to be like this? Why can't life just be fair? But as the days dragged on, the confusion and anger gave way to something else, delusionment. There was a hollow emptiness that settled in their home, as if the life had been sucked out of it along with their father's passing. Their mother, once so full of energy, seemed to age overnight. She was still physically present, but her spirit was gone. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about the little things that used to matter. And when she developed heart problem not long after, Jenny and her siblings felt like they were being hit with another wave of grief before they had even recovered from the first. Jenny could recall the day the doctor told them that her mother's condition was serious. She needed proper care, he said that day, his voice gentle but firm. Without adequate treatment, her heart will only get weaker. They all knew what that meant. Treatment cost money, money they didn't have. They had barely been making ends meet before their father died. And now, with his income gone, there was no way they could afford the kind of care their mother needed. It felt like a cruel twist of fate that after everything they were going to lose her too, simply because they couldn't afford to keep her alive. The siblings tried to pull what little they had, cutting back on everything, scraping together whatever they could, but it wasn't enough. Nothing they did was enough, and just a few months after they lost their father, their mother's heart gave out. She died quietly in her sleep, slipping away from them without a word. The delusionment that followed their death was suffocating. It felt like the world had nothing left to offer. Every day felt like a struggle just to get out of bed, to keep moving forward when there seems to be no point. What was the purpose of life if all it did was to take away the people they loved? If all it did was to leave them broken and lost? After their mother's death, the house felt hollow. Their parents, the people who had built their lives around love and sacrifice, were both gone. The grief weighed heavily on Jenny and her siblings. They clung to one another, trying to find comfort, but it was as if the glue that had held them together had been ripped away. Jenny couldn't understand why life had been so cruel to them. It felt as though they had been punished for something they couldn't even comprehend. She would lie awake at night, thinking about her father and how he had given his life for a child he didn't even know. She thought about her mother, who had tried to hold on for her children but had been broken by grief. She found herself questioning everything. All the values her parents had taught them, hard work, perseverance, faith, suddenly seemed meaningless. What good had they done for them? Her father had worked his whole life, giving everything he had for his family. And in the end, it hadn't saved him. Her mother had believed in the goodness of people, in the power of love, and yet her heart had literally given out from the weight of her grief. The questions were endless and unrelenting. It was as though everything they have ever worked for, their lives, their purpose, all the hard work and sacrifices they had made were worth anything at all. What was the point of trying so hard if in the end life could just take it all away in an instant? She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a void. The future stretched out before her, but it was empty, colorless. They had always believed that things would get better, that their struggles would pay off in the end. But now, that hope was gone, replaced by a hollow sense of disbelief. How does one recover from something like that? How do you pick up the pieces when everything you ever known has been shattered so completely? She didn't have the answers then, and to be honest, she is not sure she will ever will. But in the days after their mother's death, as they all stood at their graves, Jenny realized one thing: life wasn't fair, it wasn't kind, and it didn't care about the plans anyone made. Just like their father had once said, she wished desperately then that she could see to tell him how right he was. After their parents' death, life didn't simply stop, even though it felt like it should have. The days moved on, relentless and indifferent to their grief, and somehow they had to keep moving too. But it wasn't easy. They were like a ship adrift at sea, no longer anchored by the strong hands that had once guided them through every storm. At first, none of them knew how to cope. They had always relied on their parents for strength, for direction, and now, with them gone, there was a sense of deep, overwhelming loss, not just of them, but of the life they had known. Jenny spent the first few weeks after their mother's passing in a kind of daze, going through the memories of daily life without really feeling present. She woke up each morning, got dressed, and went to work at a small school where she taught. But everything felt hollow. The world around her seemed muted, as though someone had turned the color down on life itself. Adana, on the other hand, threw herself into her work. She started staying late at her tailoring center, working long hours and taking on more projects than she does before. She was trying to escape the grief by drowning herself in business. But even though Jenny could see it, she didn't know how to help her sister. Maybe she didn't want to help. Maybe she just wanted to forget, even if only for a few hours at a time. One evening, Jenny came home and found her hunched over her sewing machine, her hands trembling as she worked. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but she kept stitching, determined not to stop. Adana, she said gently, touching her sister's shoulder, you need to rest. Adana didn't look up. I can't, she said, her voice tight. If I stop, I will think about them. Her words hung in the air between them, raw and heavy. Jenny didn't push her to stop. She just sat beside her, silent but present, knowing that sometimes all they could do was hold on to each other in the midst of the storm. For Jenny, navigating her grief was like walking through a fog. Some days were better than others. On good days, she could focus on her work, on the children she taught, and for a few hours, she could pretend that everything was normal. But on the bad days, when the memories of her parents crept up on her like shadows, It felt like she was drowning. They each grieved in their own ways, but the one thing that kept them from not falling apart completely was each other. In the months after their parents died, when their world came crashing down, when the pillars that had held their lives together were ripped away without mercy or warning, that left them shattered. But for Jenny, despite family, the pain still turned into something else. It became anger, an anger so deep and consuming that for a whole year, it felt like her only companion despite the family support. She often wondered what would have happened if she was alone. Each time she thought about it, she felt really grateful for the support system in her siblings. She was angry at everything and everyone. Angry when she saw people laughing as if the world hadn't fallen apart. Angry when she saw children walking hand in hand with their parents, their lives untouched by tragedy. She was angry at life, at its unfairness, at the way it had stripped them of everything and left them to pick up the pieces alone. Her parents had worked so hard, and for what? They never got to see their dreams for their children come true. It felt like all their sacrifices had been for nothing. She simply was just angry all the time. That anger followed her everywhere, coloring every interaction, every thought. On her 23rd birthday, she felt it more than ever. There was no reason to celebrate. Even though her big brother sent a little money, he was back in school now, working to fulfill his promise to their dad, paying his way through with the money he earned from programming gigs. He had promised Jenny that once he finished, it would be her turn, that she would finally get to go to school like they had all dreamed. But that promise felt so distant. It didn't take away the pain. So on that fateful day, instead of celebrating, Jenny found herself walking aimlessly, trying to clear her mind of the depressive thoughts that had taken over her life. It was a Saturday. Her younger brother had gone to play football with his friends, and she was alone at home. The silence of the house was amplifying her thoughts. So she left the house and walked for what felt like hours, her mind a storm of anger and resentment. When she finally turned back toward home, she decided to buy some ice cream, just something small for her and her younger brother. It wasn't much, but it was all she could think of that might bring a little sweetness to an otherwise bitter day. After making her selections, she went to the counter to pay, and that's when cashier stopped her. "Your ice cream has already been paid for," she said, smiling. Jenny frowned. "By who?" She pointed to a figure walking out the door, and without thinking, she ran after him. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the anger. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't raised to accept handouts. Either way, she caught up to him just outside the shop. "Hey!" she called out, and she turned around. He was tall, with a handsome face, but she didn't care about that. She was too caught up in her own emotions. "You paid for my ice cream?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He smiled, looking a little taken aback. "Yeah, I thought I'll do something nice." Jenny shook her head, handing him the money. "I wasn't raised that way. Take your money back," she said. His smile faltered, and for a moment he looked at her with confusion. "No, it's fine, really. It's just ice cream." But Jenny wasn't in the mood to argue, so she shoved the ice cream towards him. "Then take the ice cream. If you wanted to pay for it badly, you might as well have it." His eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't wait for his response. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him standing there, probably wondering what had just happened. Jenny didn't actually care. She wasn't in the mood for anyone. Her mind was too clouded with resentment, too filled with the weight of everything she had been carrying. A few steps later, she had already forgotten about him. Her thoughts returned to the familiar anger, the pain, the never ending questions about why life had to be this way. Why them? Why did everything have to be so hard? The truth was, she had changed. The Jennifer who used to find joy in teaching, who used to light up the solving math problem, was gone. She had stopped teaching altogether. The mathematics that had once brought her so much happiness now felt like her worst enemy, a constant reminder of the life she thought was supposed to have but never got. She pushed everyone away, her friends, co workers, even her family, though they were the only ones who understood. Her siblings put up with her anger, bitterness, but she knew it wasn't easy for them. Her elder brother had taken charge of most of the household expenses, using what little money their big brother sent when he could. She never complained, never made Jenny feel guilty, but she could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Sometimes Jenny wondered how she did it, how she managed to stay so strong when she felt like she was falling apart. That day, after walking away from the stranger who had bought the ice cream, Jenny went home and sat in the dark, the coldness of the room mirroring the coldness inside her. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time, but there was an emptiness, a hollowness that she couldn't shake. One evening after work, someone tapped her on the shoulder just as she reached the gate of their house. She turned around, already on edge, and there he was, the ice cream guy, the same guy who had paid for her ice cream weeks ago. Jenny stared at him, the surprise and confusion mixing with the usual anger that simmered just beneath the surface. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone here, at her gate. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "Are you stalking me now?" He opened his mouth, probably to explain, but she didn't give him the chance. The irritation that had been building all day exploded before she could stop it. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't need you following me around like some kind of benefactor." Jenny snapped. "I didn't ask for your help before, and I definitely don't need it now." He blinked, caught off guard by the venom in her voice, but still, he didn't say anything. Maybe he was trying to figure out how to respond, or maybe he was just too stunned by her hostility. Either way, Jenny wasn't interested in hearing what he had to say. She turned on her heel and stormed inside, jamming the gate shut behind her with more force than necessary. Once she was inside, her mind raced. How had he found me? How did he know where I lived? She pondered. The thought of him somehow knowing where she was, watching her, sent a shiver of unease down her spine. For a moment, she considered going back out there, confronting him again, demanding answers. But she didn't. She forced herself to take a deep breath, pushing down the wave of anger that had risen inside her. He was probably just some overly nice person who didn't understand boundaries. If she ignored him, he would go away eventually. At least, that's what she told herself. But he didn't go away. Day after day, week after week, Jenny found him waiting outside the gate. Sometimes, he would be standing there when she left for work in the morning. Other times, he would be there when she returned in the evening. At first, he would try to talk to her, offering a friendly hello or a polite nod. But she ignored him, brushing past without so much as a glance in his direction. Eventually, he stopped trying to speak. He would just stand there, watching her as she walked out or came back home. He didn't follow her or try to invade her space. He just stayed there, as if he was waiting for something. At first, it unnerved her. She wasn't used to anyone sticking around once they realized how angry and unapproachable she was. But as the days passed, she found herself becoming more curious about him. Who was this guy? And why did he keep coming back? Even though she had made it clear that she didn't want anything to do with him. It didn't take long for her siblings to find out. Adana was the first to catch on. One afternoon, as Jenny was leaving the house, she peeked through the window and spotted him standing by the gate. "So, who is the guy waiting for you every day?" she asked casually when Jenny came back inside. She rolled her eyes, annoyed that Adana had noticed. "No one," she muttered, brushing past her sister. But she wasn't one to let things go easily. "Really, he doesn't look like no one. He looks like someone who is waiting for you every other day." Jenny sighed, knowing there was no escaping her question. It's just some guy who bought me ice cream once. I didn't know why he keeps showing up. Jenny finally blurted. Adana's eyebrows shot up. Ice cream, huh? Well, that's a first. Jenny groaned. Can we not make a big deal out of this? He's just annoying. But it was too late. The next day, her sister had already told Chid, their younger brother, and soon enough, they both started calling her the ice cream girl. It was a nickname that stuck despite her protest. What surprised her the most was that, without realizing it, the ice cream man, John, as she would later learn his name, brought something back into their lives they hadn't had in a long time: laughter. At first, it was just her siblings teasing her, making jokes about how she turned into something more. There was laughter at the dining table again, smiles that had been absent for months. And it wasn't just her siblings who noticed the change. Jenny did too. She found herself thinking about John more often than she wanted to admit. His persistence was both irritating and intriguing. He didn't push or demand anything from her. He just showed up day after day, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Eventually, Jenny decided to stop ignoring him. She started looking for him as she left the house, curious to see if he was still there. And he always was, standing quietly by the gate, his presence somehow comforting in a way she couldn't quite explain. It was strange, this slow shift in her attitude towards him. But Jenny wasn't ready to admit that she wanted to talk to him or that she even liked him being there. But she couldn't deny that his persistence had stirred something inside her. For long, she had been angry, shutting everyone out, pushing people away. But John, this stranger, with quiet patience, was starting to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jenny wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. She didn't want to admit it, not to herself and certainly not to anyone else. But John's presence had started to wear down the fortress she had built around herself. Day after day, he showed up at the gate, and day after day, he waited. There was a quiet persistence about him, something that both annoyed her and intrigued her at the same time. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jenny came home and found him waiting by the gate as usual. She was tired, her feet ached, and she wasn't in the mood for conversation. But something about the way he stood there, quietly without expectation, made her pause. She stopped in front of the gate, her hand resting on the latch. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the familiar surge of anger. Instead, she felt something else, something softer, more vulnerable. What do you want from me? Jenny asked, her voice quieter than usual. He looked at her, his expression calm but earnest. I don't want anything from you, he said simply. I just thought you could use a friend. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. A friend. It had been so long since she had even thought about having a friend. Since her parents' death, she had shut everyone out, isolating herself from anything that might remind her of what she had lost. The idea of letting someone back into her life, of trusting someone again, felt impossible. But John didn't push. He just stood there, waiting for her to make the next move. The next time Jenny saw him, she was more prepared. She had been thinking about what he said, that he wasn't expecting anything, that he just wanted to be a friend. The idea of friendship felt foreign to Jennifer now. But John was curious. Why was he so interested in being her friend? What did he see in her that made him keep coming back despite her coldness? When she left the house that morning, Jennifer found him standing by the gate again. This time, she didn't ignore him. She didn't walk past him, her head down, or pretend he wasn't there. She stopped, met his eyes, and asked, Why? John raised an eyebrow, clearly confused by her question. Why what? Why do you keep coming back? You don't even know me. He smiled that same easy, unaffected smile she had seen the first day they met. Because I think there's more to you than what you show people, he said, and I would like to get to know that person. Jennifer wasn't sure how to respond. His answer surprised her, not because it was anything extraordinary, but because it was simple, genuine. He wasn't trying to impress her or win her over. He was just being honest. For the first time, she didn't feel the urge to push him away. Instead, she found herself nodding, almost without thinking. Okay, she said quietly, but just so you know, I'm not exactly great company these days. John chuckled, a soft warm sound that felt out of place in gloom she had been living in. That's okay. I'm not here to fix you or anything. I'm just here. And he was. Days after day, John continued to show up at the gate. But now things were different. Jennifer had stopped seeing him as an annoyance or threat. She had started to look forward to their brief interactions, even if she didn't fully understand why. There was something comforting about his presence, something that made her feel like, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't completely alone. It wasn't long before they started talking more. At first, it was just small talk. How her day had gone, what he had been up to, the usual polite conversation. But as the weeks went on, their conversations deepened. John had a way of asking questions that made Jennifer think, that made her reflect on things she hadn't allowed herself to think about in a long time. One evening, as they sat on the steps outside the gate, he asked her about her parents. What were they like? He asked, his tone gentle but curious. Jennifer hesitated. Talking about her parents still felt like opening a wound, one that had fully healed. But there was something about John, his patience, his sincerity, that made her feel safe enough to share. They were everything, she said slowly, struggling to find the right words. They worked hard, they loved us. They did everything they could to get us a better life, but life wasn't kind to them. John nodded, listening intently, but he didn't interrupt. He just let her talk, let her pour out the words she had been holding in for a long time. They died before they could see any of their children's dreams come true, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. They sacrificed so much. It felt like it was all for nothing. John was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink. Then he spoke, his voice soft but steady. It wasn't for nothing. You and your siblings, they gave you a foundation, something to hold on to. Even when everything else falls apart, you are still here, living because of them. His words hit Jennifer harder than she expected. She had spent so long feeling their deaths had been pointless, like all their hard work had been in vain. But John's perspective made her see it all differently. Maybe their sacrifices weren't wasted. Maybe they had given her and her siblings something that could be measured in achievement or success. As the days turned into weeks, their friendship blossomed in ways Jennifer hadn't anticipated. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the quiet moments when John would just listen without judgment, without trying to fix her. He never pushed her to be anyone other than who she was. And in that space, she started to heal. It wasn't some dramatic transformation. Jennifer didn't wake up one day and suddenly feel like everything was okay. But little by little, the anger that had consumed her began to fade. It was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled her the way it had before. There was room for other emotions now: curiosity, gratitude, and even laughter. John had a way of making her laugh when she least expected it. He would tell her stories about his childhood, about the silly things he and his friends used to do. And before Jennifer knew it, she would start laughing too. It was strange, feeling joy again, but it wasn't unwelcome. In fact, it felt like something she had been missing for far too long. One evening, as the sun was setting and they sat on the steps in front of the gate. John turned to Jennifer and said something that would stick with her for a long time. You know, it's okay to be angry, he said. It's okay to feel all the things you are feeling, but don't let those feelings keep you from living your life. Your parents wouldn't want that. Jennifer looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of his statement. How do you know what they would want? He smiled, a small sad smile. I don't, but I know that people who love you don't want you to live in pain. They want you to find happiness, even after they are gone. His words echoed in Jennifer's mind long after that conversation. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had spent too long living in the shadow of her grief, letting it define her, when all her parents had ever wanted was for them to live full, happy lives. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them deepened in ways neither of them had expected. What had started as an unlikely friendship began to shift into something more, something warmer, more personal. It was like a slow fire, one that burned quietly beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. John had become more than just the ice cream man. He had become a steady presence in her life, someone she could rely on, even when she didn't realize she needed it. And without even trying, he managed to weave himself into the fabric of her family. It wasn't long before Jennifer's siblings began to take notice of the changes in her. She wasn't the angry, bitter person she had been for long. There was still grief, still pain, but John had given her room to breathe, to be more than just her anger. And in that space, she started to rediscover parts of herself she had forgotten. Her sense of humor, her curiosity, her ability to care for others. So the ice cream man, her sister said one evening as they sat in the living room, her voice light but probing. He's more than just a random guy now, huh? Jennifer shot her a look, trying to act casual, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. He's just a friend, she muttered, knowing full well how weak that sounded. Her sister raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. Oh, come on, Jennifer. I see the way you look at him. You are not fooling anyone. Before Jennifer could protest, her younger brother Chima chimed in from across the room. She's right, you know, he said with a grin. You've been a lot nicer lately. We've all noticed it. Jennifer wanted to be annoyed by their teasing, but the truth was, she couldn't deny it. John had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. He had brought a light back into her life that she thought she had lost forever. And now, even her siblings could see it. One day, after John and Jennifer had spent an hour talking on the steps outside, she invited him inside for the first time. It wasn't a grand moment, just a simple invitation, but it felt significant. It was the first time she had let someone outside her family into their home since her parents' death. And in that moment, it felt like a step towards something more. Her siblings were home when they walked in, and the looks on their faces were priceless. Her sister raised her eyebrows in surprise, and her younger brother smiled, clearly holding back a comment. But to their credit, they didn't say anything, at least not in front of John. They sat down in the living room, and for the first time, John was introduced to her family properly. It was awkward at first. Her siblings weren't used to having strangers in the house, especially not someone Jennifer had brought home. But John, with his easygoing nature and quiet confidence, quickly put everyone at ease. Before long, they were all laughing together, sharing stories, and it was as if they had been part of their lives all along. As the days went on, John became a regular fixture in Jennifer's home. Her siblings warmed up to him quickly, especially her younger brother, who seemed to admire him for reasons she didn't fully understand at the time. Her sister, of course, couldn't resist teasing her every chance she got. But even she admitted that John was different, that he had brought something into their lives that they had been missing for a long time. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jennifer's sister pulled her aside while John was talking to her brother. "You know, he's good for you," she said softly, her eyes serious for once. "I haven't seen you like this in a long time." Jennifer nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know, he's different." Her sister smiled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. "Just be careful, okay? It's been a rough couple of years, and I don't want to see you get hurt again." Jennifer appreciated her sister's concern, but deep down, she knew that John wasn't like anyone else. He wasn't there to hurt her. He had stayed through her worst moments, her anger, her grief, and he hadn't flinched. If anything, he had become even more patient, even more caring. It was strange how seamlessly John fit into their lives. For so long, Jennifer had shut everyone out, convinced that no one could understand what they had been through, that no one could fill the void left by their parents. But John wasn't trying to replace them. He was simply there, offering support and kindness in the ways he could. And before Jennifer knew it, she realized that she didn't just care about him as a friend. Somewhere along the way, something deeper had developed between them, something she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge but couldn't ignore either. One day after dinner, they sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was warm and the sky was painted with shades of pink and orange. It was one of those quiet, peaceful moments where everything felt right in the world, even if only for a little while. John turned to Jennifer, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed, you know," he said softly. "When I first met you, I could feel how much pain you were carrying, but now you seem lighter." Jennifer smiled. There was a still part of her that felt vulnerable, admitting it. "I guess I have. You've helped with that." He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and gentle. "I'm glad I could be part of your life, Jenny. You've become important to me." The words hung between them, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. Jennifer felt her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in years, and for the first time, she let herself imagine a future, one where John was part of it. "You are important to me too," Jennifer whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying all the weight of what she was feeling. In that moment, she knew that whatever was going between them was real. It was something worth holding on to. As the days passed and their connection deepened, Jennifer found herself growing more curious about John. For so long, he had been this steady, unshaking presence in her life. But she realized she didn't know much about him. He had been there for her, patiently listening and supporting her through her grief. But now, she wanted to know more about him, who he was, where he came from, and what made him the person he had become. One evening, after they had been sitting together for a while, Jennifer turned to him and asked, "John, you've listened to me talk about my family and everything, but I don't know how much, okay?" One evening, after they had been sitting together for a while, Jennifer turned to him and asked, "John, you've listened to me talk about my family and everything I've been through, but I don't know much about you. What's your story?" He hesitated for a moment, his expression thoughtful, as if deciding how much to share. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back against the porch railing and began to speak. "I grew up in a very different kind of family than yours," he said quietly. "My parents were distant, not in a physical way. They were always there, technically, but emotionally, they weren't really present. My dad was a businessman," John continued, his voice steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "He was always focused on his work, on making money, and he didn't have much time for me or anything else. My mom was the same. She was more interested in appearance than in being there for us. I don't remember them ever sitting down with me or my siblings just to talk or asking how we were doing. It was all about keeping up to the facade of being the perfect family." Jennifer nodded, trying to place the kind of life he was describing. It was so far removed from the warmth of her own family that it almost felt foreign. So, did you have anyone you could talk to? She asked gently. John shrugged. Not really. I had friends, but they didn't really know what was going on at home. And I wasn't the type to open up easily back then. I guess I just got used to keeping everything to myself. As he spoke, Jennifer could hear the quiet pain in his voice. The years of feeling unseen and unheard by the people who were supposed to love him most. It made her realize that in his own way, John had experienced loss too. Not the physical loss of his parents, but the emotional distance that had left him feeling alone, even when they were around. And that's why you are so patient, she said softly, the realization dawning on her. You've had to learn to be, haven't you? John smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. Yeah, I guess you could say that. When you grow up feeling like you don't really matter, you learn to be patient. You wait for people to see you, to acknowledge you, but sometimes they never do. Jennifer reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. But you are not invisible to me, John. You are not alone. Jennifer felt a pang of sadness for him. John had spent so much of his life feeling like he didn't belong, like he didn't fit the mold his family had created for him. And yet, here he was, kind, patient, and compassionate, despite everything he had been through. I'm sorry, she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. I didn't know you had gone through all that. He smiled, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. It's okay. It's made me who I am today. And honestly, I think that's why I connected with you. I saw that you were carrying a lot of pain, and I understood it. I know what it feels like to be weighed down by things you can't control. It wasn't long before Jennifer's siblings started asking more questions about him too. Her younger brother, who had always been wary of new people, seemed to warm up to John faster than she expected. One afternoon, Jennifer found the two of them sitting in the living room, deep in conversation. Her brother, who had been struggling with his studies, was asking John for advice, and to his surprise, John was offering more than just words of encouragement. You should have seen me in school, John said with a grin. I wasn't the best student either, but I learned how to make it work. You will get there. Her brother looked at him with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Jennifer realized that John wasn't just becoming part of her life, he was becoming part of their family. Even her sister, who had been skeptical at first, started to soften. One evening, as they all sat down for dinner, she turned to John and said, You know, I wasn't sure about you at first, but I think you are good for Jenny. You've brought her back to us. John smiled, his eyes meeting Jennifer's across the table. She's brought a lot into my life too, he said softly. As the months passed, it became clear that John was no longer just a visitor in their lives. He was part of them now, part of their story. And as Jennifer's friendship with him deepened into something more, she found herself falling for him in ways she hadn't thought possible. For the longest time, Jennifer didn't think she was capable of love anymore, not after everything she had lost. But John showed her that love wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the pain. It was about finding someone who could stand beside you and, in the midst of it all, someone who could carry that weight with you. In him, she found that person. And slowly, Jennifer began to realize that they had so many more just than friendship. It was love, deep, steady, and real. John had made it clear from the very beginning he didn't want anything from his family. It wasn't that they didn't have the means to help them. In fact, they had more than enough. His father's business had flourished over the years, and his brothers, who had followed in their father's footsteps, were well off too. But that wasn't the life John wanted. We will make it on our own, he told Jenny one evening, not long after they got married. I don't want their money.
I don't want them thinking they can control us, that they can interfere in our lives because we are taking something from them. Jenny understood where he was coming from. His family was the kind that believed money could fix anything, that success was measured in wealth and status. But that wasn't John's definition of success, and it wasn't hers either. They both knew that accepting his family's help would come with strange attached expectations, judgments, and a kind of invisible control that neither of them wanted hanging over their lives. So they made a decision early on. They would rely on each other, on what they could earn, and they would be content with whatever that brought them. It wasn't an easy choice. There were times when they struggled, when the money ran out before the end of the month and they weren't sure how they would make it to the next payday. But through it all, they stayed committed to building their life together on their own terms. As the days turned into months, Jenny often found herself reflecting on the lessons her parents had taught her growing up. Lessons that, in many ways, were now guiding her marriage. Her parents hadn't had much, but they had worked hard for everything they did have. They had always been honest about their struggles, but they had never let those struggles define them. Instead, they had taught their children the value of resilience and consistency, of pushing through even when things seemed impossible.
Now, as she faced her own challenges, Jenny found strength in those lessons. Life wasn't easy, but she knew that she and John had the tools to make it work. They didn't need anyone else's help. They didn't need his family's money or their interference. What they needed was each other, and as long as they had that, they would be okay. John, too, understood the value of hard work. He had walked away from the wealth and privilege of his family because he wanted something real, something he could build with his own hands. Jenny admired him for that. He could have taken the easy route, could have accepted their money and lived comfortably, but that wasn't who he was. We will get there, he would say whenever they faced another financial setback. It might take longer, but we will make it. And even though there were moments when Jenny worried, when the bills piled up and the cupboards were nearly bare, there was a quiet confidence in John's voice that always reassured her. He wasn't afraid of the struggle. In fact, she thought he welcomed it because it meant that when they did make it, it would be on their terms, not anyone else's. There were times when her sister had to step in, quietly slipping them money for groceries or helping them cover a bill they couldn't afford. Jenny felt guilty accepting her help, but her sister always reminded her that family was there for each other, just as their parents had been there for them. It wasn't about pride, it was about survival. And in those moments, Jenny was reminded that while they were determined to build their life on their own, it didn't mean they had to do it entirely alone. One evening, as John and Jenny sat together in their tiny apartment, she found herself thinking about everything they had been through, everything they had overcome. It wasn't a glamorous life. They didn't have the things other people had, the big house, the fancy cars, the luxuries that John's family had taken for granted. But they had each other. And to Jenny, that was worth more than all the money in the world. I know this isn't what most people dreamed about, John said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. But this is what I want. I want us to build something together, from the ground up. No shortcuts, no handouts, just us. Jenny smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. It's what I want too. There was a long pause before John spoke again, his voice softer this time. I know, right? Those words stayed with Jenny long after the conversation had ended, long after the lights had been turned off and they had gone to bed. There was something beautiful in the simplicity of their life together, something that made all the sacrifices and hardship worth it. Looking back, Jenny realized that her parents had given her more than just the tools to survive. They had given her the ability to find contentment in the midst of the struggle. They had taught her that life wasn't about what you had, but about who you had beside you. And now, with John by her side, she knew that they would face whatever challenges came their way with the same resilience and strength that her parents had shown her. They didn't need a lot of money. They didn't need the approval of John's family. What they needed was the love they had for each other and the determination to build something real, something lasting. And that, in the end, was more than enough. Life as a married couple had been blissful, even with the struggles. John and Jenny had found happiness in the small things, their love for each other, the laughter that filled their tiny apartment, and the unwavering support from her family. They didn't have much, but what they had was enough. At least, that's what Jenny thought. One morning, John woke her up with a strange excitement in his eyes. I want to take you somewhere today, he said, his voice full of anticipation. Jenny smiled, thinking it was some kind of surprise. John was always thoughtful, always finding little ways to make life special. Where are we going? She asked, sitting up and stretching. You will see, he replied. His grin widening. Just get ready, you will love it. She didn't press him further. Jenny liked surprises, and she trusted John. He had never given her a reason to doubt him before. So after making breakfast and cleaning up, she got ready, letting the anticipation build. Whatever he had planned, she was sure it was going to be something wonderful. They left their neighborhood and took a taxi to a part of the city Jenny rarely visited, the wealthiest part. As they drove past towering mansions and sprawling estates, she felt a sense of curiosity start to creep in. This was a world far removed from theirs, and she couldn't help but wonder why John had brought her there. When the taxi stopped in front of a grand house, the largest and most prominent in the area, Jenny turned to John with a raised eyebrow. What are we doing here? Just trust me, he said, taking her hands as they stepped out of the car. You will understand soon. A lot of thought ran through her mind as they walked towards the entrance. Was this a gift? A house tour? Maybe he had gotten a new job, something that would allow them to live in a place like this one day. She didn't know, but Jenny trusted him. So she let the question simmer quietly in the back of her mind as they approached the front door. The way people welcomed them was strange. They greeted John warmly, with a familiarity that felt out of place, given that Jenny had never met any of them. It was as if they knew him, really knew him, and yet here she was, completely in the dark. Finally, John turned to her, his smile still in place, but there was something serious in his eyes now. This, he said, motioning to the house around, is my house. Jenny blinked, confused. What do you mean, your house? This property? This mansion? This looks like it could cost more than I can imagine. Is yours? John nodded, still smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Yes, it's mine. Ours now, actually. The words hit Jenny like a brick. For a moment, she didn't understand. She couldn't understand. It didn't make sense. They had been married for almost 3 years, and not once had he ever mentioned owning a house like this. They had lived in a small one-room apartment, scraping by to make ends meet. How could this be true? You've been lying to me, she whispered, her voice shaking. I've been living a lie for almost 3 years. John's smile faltered, and Jenny saw the concern flicker across his face. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, stepping back, the shock and betrayal coursing through her. Jenny, please, he said, his voice filled with urgency. It's not what you think. Just hear me out. She stood there, staring at him, her heart racing. There had to be some explanation, something that made this all make sense. So she took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, and nodded. Okay, I'm listening. Explain. John cleared his throat, clearly revealed that Jenny was willing to hear him out. He began to speak, his voice measured but strained. You see, my parents were always against my choice of you as my wife. He began. They were worried. They thought you might be marrying me for the money. I tried to tell them that you weren't like that you loved me for who I am, not for what I had. But they didn't believe me. Not after everything that had happened with my brother's ex wife. Jenny frowned, confused but still listening. His ex wife nearly ruined him. John continued. She married him for the money. And when they divorced, she took everything she could. My parents were devastated. And then, my younger sister's fiance, well, he stole from her all the money she had saved up to travel abroad. He took it and disappeared. My family became skeptical. They didn't trust anyone who wasn't from a wealthy background. As he spoke, a door opened, and Jenny saw his parents walked in, followed by his siblings. They looked at her with smiles that felt strange. First, as if this was all some kind of game they had won. John glanced at them before turning back to her. They wanted to test you, he said, his voice quieter now. They needed to see for themselves that you weren't a gold digger. So I agreed to live simply with you, to prove to them that you weren't after my money. Jenny's heart sank as his word registered. The small apartment, the struggles, the sacrifices, it all had been part of a test. A test she didn't even know she was taking. John's mother stepped forward, her smile broad as she extended her hand. Congratulations, dear, she said. You've passed the test. We are so glad to finally welcome you into the family properly. Her words were like salt in a wound. Past the test, Jenny's marriage, her love for John, had been reduced to some kind of experiment, a trial to see if she was worthy of being part of their wealthy family. They hadn't trusted her. John hadn't trusted her. She felt numb as she stood there, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. John's family was smiling, congratulating her, but all she could hear was the defending silence in her mind. This wasn't love. This wasn't trust. Slowly, she stood up from her chair with a finality that felt like a knife cutting through the air. I'm done, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a pain that ran deep. I'm done with this marriage. The silence that followed was defending. John's eyes widened in shock, and his family's smiles disappeared, replaced with confusion and disbelief. Jenny, wait, John said, rushing after her as she turned and made her way towards the door. What do you mean you are done? You can't just walk away like this. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, and turned to face him. The hurt in his eyes mirrored her own, but there was something else there too, shock, disbelief, as if he truly didn't understand why this was happening. You lied to me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You lied to me for almost 3 years. You made me part of some falsehood. How can I trust you now? You know me, John. You know everything about me, and yet you did this. She could hear her own voice breaking. The hurt laced through every word. Her hand trembled on the doorknob as she waited for John to say something. Anything that could make this make sense. But he stood there, frozen, his mouth opened as if to respond. But no words came out. He was helpless, just as she felt helpless, watching everything she thought they had built together crumble in an instant. The silence between them was suffocating. Jenny couldn't bear it any longer. Without another word, she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind everything she had believed was real. Her world was spinning. She felt like she had been dropped into a whirlwind, and she had no idea where or when she would land, if she would ever land. The city seemed blurry, the people and buildings passing by in a haze. It was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her, and she was falling helplessly. Jenny didn't know how she found her way home. One moment she was walking, numb and disoriented, and the next she was standing in front of her family's house. She realized with a jolt that she didn't even have money to pay for the taxi that had brought her there. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone and called Adana, her sister. She didn't have the strength to explain, and she didn't need to when Adana stepped out of the house and saw Jenny's face. She panicked, her eyes widened with concern, her movements quick and urgent as she approached the car. She didn't say anything, just paid the driver while casting worried glances in Jenny's direction. Jenny couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to explain the storm inside her. Instead, she walked past her and into the house, her legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. Inside, her brothers were sitting in the living room, but she barely registered their presence. Their concerned voices were like muffled sounds in the background as she walked straight to the bedroom and lay down. She didn't have the energy to talk, didn't have the strength to face their questions. Jenny lay there, staring at the ceiling, the events of the day swelling in her mind. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about John, had been shattered. He knew her, he knew everything about her, and yet he had still chosen to lie, to put her through that test without her knowledge. It felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than she had words for. Her brothers knew that something was terribly wrong. They hovered in the hallway, their whispers just loud enough for her to hear, but no one came into the room. Maybe they knew she wasn't ready to talk, or maybe they were waiting for her to come to them when she was ready. After what felt like hours, Jenny heard the sound of her elder brother's voice. "Hello, what happened? Why is she looking like somebody died?" he asked, his voice tense. He was silent for a while, and when next his voice echoed down the hallway, it was filled with rage. "You should have told her the truth from the beginning. How could you put her through that?" Jenny didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation to know who he was talking to. It was John, of course. It was John. He must have called, panicked after she left. He must have known that she would come here, that she would run to her family because they were the only people she could trust now. But even as she listened to her brother tear into him, Jenny felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, just emptiness. The world felt cold, distant, like it was happening somewhere far away from her. Adana came into the room after their brother's shouting died down. She sat beside Jenny on the bed, her eyes soft with concern but filled with the kind of quiet understanding only a sister could offer. "Jenny, what happened?" Adana asked gently, placing a hand on her sister's arms. Jenny swallowed hard, trying to find the words, but they felt stuck in her throat, too heavy to push out. After a moment, she shook her head, unable to speak. Adana didn't press. She just sat there, her presence a quiet comfort. She knew in her own way that whatever had happened was something big, something that had shaken Jenny to her core. The hours passed slowly. Her brothers checked in periodically, their worry evident, but they didn't push for answers. They were angry, angry at John, angry at the situation. But for now, they gave Jenny space. She needed that space. She needed time to process everything, to try and understand how her world had turned upside down in the span of a single day. Later that evening, her elder brother came into the room. He didn't say so much at first, just stood by the doorway, his arms crossed as he watched her. "He's a fool, you know," he said finally, his voice low but full of frustration. "I don't know what he was thinking, putting you through that." Jenny nodded, but she still couldn't speak. The weight of the day was pressing down on her, making it hard for her to breathe. "He's been calling non-stop," her brother continued, wanted to explain himself, to fix things, but after what he did, he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "You don't owe him anything, Jenny, not after this." Jenny knew he was right. She didn't owe John anything, but the problem was her heart didn't seem to agree. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, there was still a part of her that loved John, and that made it all so much harder. She wasn't surprised when John came looking for her. He had always been persistent, always the one to fight for what he believed in. But this time, it wasn't about a small disagreement or misunderstanding. This time, the betrayal cut too deep, and the stakes were much higher. It had been a few days since Jenny walked out of the house, leaving John standing there in shock. Each day brought more clarity, but it also brought more hurt. She had thought she knew him. She had thought their marriage was built on love, on trust. But now, it felt like everything they had shared had been a lie. When John showed up at her family house, Jenny didn't want to see him. She wasn't ready to face him, to hear whatever excuses he had prepared. But her elder brother, ever the protective one, intercepted him at the door, making it clear that John wasn't welcome unless Jenny wanted him there. She could hear their voices from the back of the house, her brother's anger simmering just below the surface, John's quiet desperation as he tried to explain himself. I just want to talk to her, John said, his voice pleading. Please, I need to explain. Her brother wasn't having it. You had your chance to explain, John. She trusted you, and you let her down. What makes you think she wants to hear anything you have to say now? There was a pause, and for a moment, Jenny thought John would leave. But then he spoke again, his voice softer, more vulnerable. Because I love her, he said simply, and I made a mistake, but I need her to know why. Against her better judgment, Jenny let in. Maybe it was because, deep down, she still wanted answers, or maybe it was because part of her still cared, still loved him, despite everything. Either way, she found herself sitting across from him in the living room, her arms crossed defensively, waiting for him to explain. He looked at her with eyes that were filled with regret, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. It was clear that he knew he had messed up, but what Jenny needed to understand was why. Jenny, he began, his voice trembling slightly. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that. She stayed silently, her gaze steady as she waited for him to continue. When I met you, he said, I knew you were different. You didn't care about money, about status. You cared about me, about the real me, not the version of me that my family had built. And that's why I fell in love with you. Jenny swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. Then why lie to me? Why put me through all that if you knew who I was? John sighed, running a hand on his hair in frustration. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When I told my parents of my intention to get married, and they found out about your background, they were immediately suspicious. They thought you were just another person trying to take advantage of me. After what happened with my brother and sister, they were paranoid. They didn't trust anyone, especially not someone who wasn't wealthy. Jenny raised an eyebrow, her anger simmering beneath the surface. So you let them manipulate you. You let them make me go through all of that just to prove a point? John shook his head quickly. No, it wasn't like that. I tried to fight them, Jenny. I tried to tell them that you were different, that you weren't like the others, but they wouldn't listen. They were relentless, and eventually I gave in. His words hung in the air, and Jenny could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. He has chosen his family over their relationship. He had let their fears and insecurity dictate how he treated her. I thought if I could prove to them that you were the real deal, John continued, they would finally accept us. I thought it would be easier to live simply for a while, to show them that you weren't after the money. I never imagined it would hurt you like this. Jenny stared at him, her heart torn between the love she had for him and the betrayal she couldn't shake. And what about me, John? What about what I went through? You let me suffer. You let me struggle, watching as I worked myself to the bone, while you knew you had the means to help. Where were you even going all this while you claimed you were going to work? You leave the house and go to your big air-conditioned office, eat your well-balanced food, and you come home to me in the evening, pretending something else. You watched me go hungry, eat the barest minimum most times, and it didn't occur to you that you are simply a wicked soul. What kind of love do you profess to me? So if you didn't actually love me, what would you have made me go through? Jenny continued to bombard him with questions. John's face fell, his eyes filled with regret. I thought it was just for a little while. I thought once they saw what I saw in you, it would all be over. But I was wrong. I should have told you from the beginning. I should have trusted you. For the next few weeks, John tried everything he could to win back Jenny's trust. He came to the house every day, waiting outside until she was ready to talk. Her family was divided on how to handle the situation. Her brothers, especially her elder brother, were furious. To them, John's deception was unforgivable, and they didn't want to see her hurt again. Adana, her sister, was more sympathetic. She believed that people could make mistakes, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But she also told Jenny to take her time, to make sure that if she ever gave John a second chance, it was because she truly wanted to, not because she felt pressured. John's own family, however, remained a looming shadow over them. They weren't thrilled with his attempt to reconcile with Jenny. In their eyes, she had passed their so called test, but now that she had walked away, she was no longer worthy. His parents saw it as an insult, as if she had rejected their wealth and status. His siblings were divided. Some thought she was being unreasonable, while others seemed to understand her position. But none of that mattered to Jenny. What mattered was whether or not she could trust John again. Could she forgive him for what he had done? Could she move past the lies and rebuild their marriage on a foundation of truth? One evening, after weeks of silence, Jenny finally let John back into the house for a real conversation. They sat at the kitchen table, the air heavy with unspoken words. "Why did you let them do this to us?" she asked quietly. "Why wasn't our relationship enough for you?" John's eyes were full of pain. "It was enough, Jenny. You were always enough. But I was weak. I let my family's fear control me. I wanted so badly to prove to them that you were different, that you were the right choice, that I didn't stand up for what was right. I didn't stand up for us." Jenny looked down at the table, the heart still raw. "How can I trust you now?" John reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I have to earn that back, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I mean it. I love you, Jenny, and I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." It wasn't an easy decision. Jenny's heart was still heavy with the betrayal, and the road ahead was uncertain. But as she sat there, looking into John's eyes, she realized that part of her still loved him. Part of her wanted to believe that people could change, that they could learn from their mistakes and become better. But she just didn't know how, or even if she should. 5 years had passed since the day Jenny walked out on John, leaving behind the life she thought she had known. 5 years of rebuilding, of discovering who she was without the weight of betrayal hanging over her. And in those 5 years, so much had changed. Jenny had finally earned her degree as a petroleum engineer, a dream that had felt so far away during those early days of struggle. Now, Jenny was going through her training, preparing for her induction into the Institute for Professional Chemical Engineers. It felt so real, like she had crossed some invisible line between the person she had been and the person she had become. Life, in so many ways, had gotten easier, but it wasn't just her life that had changed. Her sister Adana had transformed her passion for fashion into something remarkable. Her brand had taken off, and she now owned her own fashion house, a testament to her hard work and determination. It hadn't been easy for her either, but their brother hit it big. Everything seemed to fall into place. Her eldest brother, Ifani, had always been the one to carry the weight of the family on his shoulders. Even when they were younger, he was the one who gave up so much so they could have more. The one who worked tirelessly, even when things seemed impossible. And when he graduated with honors and secured a position with a multinational corporation, it felt like all his sacrifices had finally paid off. His success had set the family on a path of ease. With his financial stability, he had been able to give Adana the funds she needed for further training and the establishment of her fashion brand. He also ensured that Jenny went to school the following year, and when their younger brother received an admission offer to study outside the country, their brother took care of everything without stress. According to him, he was being paid well, and he made sure that none of them had to struggle the way they once did. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jenny didn't have to worry. She focused on her studies, and her brother catered to all her needs. The only thing he asked of her was to deliver the best results, and she did. She gave it everything she had because she knew that she wasn't just doing it for herself, she was doing it for her family, for her parents who had sacrificed so much but never lived long enough to see what they had achieved. That was the only sadness that lingered over their success. Her mom and dad never got to witness the fruits of all their hard work. They never saw how far the family had come, how their sacrifices had paved way for everything they now had. But Jenny knew they would have been proud. She carried their memory with her in every step she took, every achievement she made. Now they were preparing for Adana's marriage. It was a joyful time, but also one filled with caution. After everything Jenny had gone through, the family was determined to do their due diligence. They weren't going to go through the heartbreak of the seat a second time. They were careful, making sure that everything about Adana's fiancé was transparent and true. There would be no more lies in their lives. As for Jenny, marriage wasn't on her mind. She had other plans. Right now, her focus was on building her career. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let anything derail her. Her career was her priority, and she wanted to make sure that if the time ever came for her to marry, it would be on her terms, with someone who respected who she was and what she had built. She was determined that her children would never have to face what she had faced. No one would ever look down on them and call them gold diggers. She would build a life that ensured they were secured, independent, and respected. That was her promise to herself. As for John, he had come back to beg time and time again until her family moved into the new house her brother had bought. After that, Jenny never saw him again. She had heard things here and there about him, how his family continued to thrive, how he had tried to move on, but it no longer mattered to her. Even though John might have been a good person on some level, Jenny's greatest fear was giving her life to someone who wouldn't be able to protect her or her children. The deceit he had undergone to test her was something she could never overlook. What hurt the most wasn't just the test itself, but the fact that it had continued until his parents decided it was enough. He didn't make a stand as a man. What if they hadn't said it was enough? Would the charade have continued indefinitely? Would he have watched her suffer even more just to prove a point? There were so many what ifs that haunted her. Questions she would never have answers to. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Jenny knew her worth, and she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life hoping for approval from people who didn't see her for who she truly was. Jenny had forgiven him. She had to, for her own peace of mind. But she knew deep down that she could never be with him again. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and in their case, it had shattered so completely that there was no putting the pieces back together. Jenny didn't need his money. She didn't need his approval. She had everything she needed within herself, and she was determined to live her life with integrity and purpose. As she stood in her sister's new house, helping Adana prepare for her wedding, a sense of peace washed over her. She had come a long way from the girl who once felt so lost, so broken. Her family had come a long way too. They were no longer struggling, no longer scraping by. They had built something beautiful, something strong, and Jenny knew that no matter what the future held, they would continue to rise. Because they had learned that it wasn't about wealth or status, it was about resilience, about staying true to who they were, even when the world tried to break them down. And that was something no amount of money could buy. Through it all, one lesson stood out above the rest. Hard work and perseverance could change lives. Jenny's family didn't get to where they were by luck or by relying on anyone else. Every success they achieved was the result of long hours, sacrifices, and sheer determination. Their parents had planted those seeds in them, and now they were seeing them blossom. But it wasn't just hard work that carried them through, it was also their values. Jenny never forgot what they taught her about integrity, about staying true to herself even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. It was a lesson that had been tested many times, especially in her relationship with John, but it was one she held onto tightly. Know your worth. That was a lesson Jenny had to learn the hard way. When she walked away from John, she wasn't just walking away from a man, she was walking away from a situation that tried to make her doubt her value. He had tried to test her, to see if she was good enough for him and his family. But the truth was, her worth was never something to be tested or questioned. Her worth was intrinsic, built on the foundation of her person first as a human, and then on her values, her character, and the way she chose to live her life. And that was a lesson she would carry forward with her in everything she did. Jenny may marry when she was ready, but not before she had built the life she wanted. She would ensure that her children grew up knowing they never had to prove their worth to anyone. No one would ever call them gold diggers or question their integrity, because Jenny would show them through her own life what it meant to stand tall in the face of judgment. Jenny had also learned the importance of forgiveness, not for others, but for herself. She forgave John, not because he deserved it, but because holding on to that anger would have only hurt her in the end. Forgiving him allowed her to move forward with her life, free from the weight of the past. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean that she would allow herself to be put into that position again. She forgave him, but she knew she could never be with him again. Trust, once broken, cannot always be repaired, and that was something she had accepted. Most importantly, Jenny had learned that family was everything. Through all the ups and downs, her family had been her anchor. They were there for each other when the world seemed to crumble around them. Her brother, her sister, and she didn't just survive. They thrived because they had each other, and that was a lesson Jenny would carry for the rest of her life. Success wasn't just about what you achieved on your own, it was about the people who stood by you, supported you, and lifted you up when you couldn't lift yourself. So, as Jenny stood there that day, preparing for her sister's wedding, she was filled with a sense of peace and gratitude. The road hadn't been easy, but it had shaped her into the woman she had become today. She was proud of what they accomplished as a family, but more than that, she was proud of the way they had stayed true to themselves, even when the world tried to knock them down. In the end, the only thing that truly mattered was that she could look into the mirror and know that she had stayed true to herself. No amount of money, status, or approval could replace the peace that came from living with integrity. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.